嗨，大家好，欢迎收看我的视频。这个星期一，我先生又恢复了他原来的日程安排，就是周一休息在家，也可以处理工作当中的一些事情。吃过早饭，我让他帮我打了几个电话，处理了一些保险公司和医院发来的信件。然后我们谈到了最近国内发生的一些抗议活动，我先生也为他们的勇敢行为表示赞赏。同时他也为我讲述了一个发生在美国的一个伟大总统为了让普通的民众获得平等自由的权利，同一些恶势力勇敢抗争的感人故事。
In 1954, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling stating that segregation was illegal across all of the United States. Segregation was the practice of having different facilities, different agencies, different stores and restaurants for black versus white citizens. George Wallace ran for governor of the state of Alabama and lost in his first time run because he was frankly not racist enough for the voters in Alabama. In his next campaign for governor, he embraced racism and loudly shouted that he would make sure that Alabama has segregation now and segregation forever. By loudly proclaiming his racist intent, he won by a landslide. In June of 1963, Governor George Wallace stood in front of the door of the University of Alabama, refusing to let any black students enter the university, and he had state police on either side of him to make sure that no one would stop him from preventing any blacks to enter the school. President John F. Kennedy called up the Alabama National Guard. The National Guard are citizens of that state and normally under the command of the governor unless specifically called up by the president. In this case, that's exactly what happened. President John F. Kennedy called up the Alabama National Guard and had them march to the university to make the governor and the state police stand aside and let black students enter the university. Just a couple of months later, in September of 1963, Governor George Wallace again attempted to block the federal requirement that all such schools should be desegregated. In this case, he went to the Tuskegee High School. But President Kennedy once again employed his authority and federalized the National Guard troops. George Wallace could not stand up to the armed and trained National Guard troops who were now under the control of the U.S. President. George Wallace stepped aside. We may never know exactly how much it was related, but 2 months later, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas. When President Kennedy was killed, the Constitution requires that the Vice President now take over as President. Lyndon Baines Johnson, often known as his initials LBJ, was sworn in as President later on the same day that John Kennedy was killed. The political power brokers never intended for Johnson to be president. Johnson was put on the ticket as vice president simply to ensure that Southerners would vote for the ticket of Kennedy and Johnson. Surprisingly, Johnson took on the mantle of being the strongest desegregationist in the country and often used his power of the presidency to push for more and more desegregation and making sure that more and more people of color had the opportunity to gain education and jobs and political office. In addition, Johnson recognized that race was not the only factor, and he pushed through a number of laws that would specifically help the poor no matter what color. When an advisor once told Johnson that he should not push quite so hard to gain benefits for the poor and people of color because it would cause him to lose political power, Johnson famously replied, "Then what the hell is the point of being president?"
谢谢大家的收看，我们下期见。